It was one of those blazing Texas afternoons when the air itself seemed to shimmer. The highway stretched endlessly, cutting through fields of dry grass and dust. Most people avoided this road. It was too long, too empty, too silent. But for Will and his mother, it was their lifeline. Every weekend, they'd set up a small wooden stand right at the curve where cars slowed before the long stretch ahead. A crooked sign, hand-painted by Will himself, read, "Ice-cold lemonade, $1. The boy, barely 12, had a charm that made people stop. His smile wasn't forced. His voice carried that natural warmth only found in someone who hasn't yet learned to fake things. He had a way of speaking that made you feel like he really saw you, even if it was just for a few seconds." Beside him sat his mother, Maria. Her skin was worn by the sun, but her eyes still had a softness that never faded. She'd spend hours in that old wooden chair, a small Bible resting on her lap, watching her boy wave at passing cars with unshakable hope. But that day was different. Only 2 cars had stopped in 3 hours. Will tried to stay cheerful, but the lemonade pitcher was still nearly full. The ice had melted into water. Maria reached for his shoulder and said softly, "Don't worry, sweetheart. God will send someone." Will smiled, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Yeah," he whispered, "maybe someone really thirsty." Moments later in the distance, a white BMW approached. The sun bounced off its perfect paint, slicing through the haze like a blade. Will perked up. "Mom, look. That's a fancy one." Maria shaded her eyes. "He's going too fast, honey. Don't get your hopes up." But the car slowed. The tires hissed against the dry gravel as it rolled to a stop right in front of them. The engine purred for a second, then went quiet. From inside, the door opened with that solid, heavy sound that only luxury cars make. Out stepped a man in a gray tailored suit, sunglasses reflecting the empty road behind him. His shoes probably cost more than their whole stand. He looked out of place there, too clean, too perfect. And he definitely didn't look like someone who'd stop for lemonade. Will froze. His usual smile hesitated, just for a moment. The man adjusted his cufflinks, sighed, and finally said, "Kid, you actually sell anything out here?" Will blinked. "Sometimes," he said. "Not today, though. Guess folks aren't that thirsty." The man chuckled under his breath. "Or maybe they don't trust roadside lemonade." Will's face dropped slightly. "It's clean water, sir. My mom makes sure. I even wash the cups myself." Maria stood quietly, observing. She'd seen men like this before, men with money, but no peace. Men who carried something heavy behind their fine suits. The man looked at Will again. Something about the boy's eyes disarmed him. They weren't begging for anything, just honest. He sighed. "All right, kid. Give me 1 cup." Will's grin returned instantly. He poured with care, adding a few slices of lemon, swirling it like a professional bartender. "That'll be $1, sir." The man reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp 100. "I don't have change." Will stared at the bill. "That's okay. You can owe me 99 more cups." The man laughed for real this time. It wasn't forced. It came out of him like he hadn't done it in a long while. "You've got some attitude, huh?" "I've got to sell," Will said proudly. "I'm saving for something." "Oh yeah, what for?" Will thought for a second. "A camera. I want to make videos one day. You know, tell stories." The man studied him for a beat. "Stories, huh? You think people care about stories?" Will shrugged. "If it's a good one." That answer hit him harder than it should have. The man took a sip of the lemonade, then another. It wasn't great, too sweet, a little warm, but somehow it felt right. He looked at Maria again. She smiled faintly, nodding as if she could see something invisible between them forming. He pulled out another 100 and placed it on the table. "Keep the change." Will's eyes widened. "Sir, that's too much." "Consider it an investment," the man said, turning toward his car. "Investment in what?" Will called out. The man paused, his hand on the car door. He looked back at the boy, sunlight catching the edge of his glasses. "In you, maybe." He got in the car and drove off, the sound of the engine fading into the horizon. Will stood still, holding that bill like it was something sacred. Maria looked at him, quietly thoughtful. "You see, Will? I told you. God sends people when the time is right." Will nodded, still watching the dust trail disappear. "Yeah, but..." He looked kind of sad, didn't he? Maria smiled softly. "Even sad people need lemonade, baby." As the last rays of sun dipped below the fields, the stand stood there, quiet, humble, unaware that what had just happened would change all of their lives forever. That night, somewhere in a mansion overlooking Dallas, the man poured himself a drink and couldn't stop thinking about that boy's eyes. There was something there. Something he didn't have anymore. Something he wanted back. Richard couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his oversized bed, surrounded by silence that used to feel like peace, but now just echoed. The city lights glowed faintly through the glass walls of his penthouse, painting cold lines across the marble floor. He had everything. A car collection, investments in half the Fortune 500, a house that could host a small orchestra. And yet, that boy's words, "If it's a good story," kept replaying in his mind. For the first time in a long time, Richard Cole felt small. Like a man who had climbed to the top of a mountain and suddenly realized there was nothing up there but wind. He got up, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and stared at his reflection in the window. "Stories," he muttered. What the hell does a kid like that know about stories? But deep down, something in him knew the answer: everything. That boy still believed in things Richard had long since sold: honesty, kindness, meaning. He stayed awake until morning, then drove to his office early, still in yesterday's clothes. His assistant, Karen, nearly dropped her coffee when she saw him. "Sir, are you..." "I need you to find someone for me," he interrupted. Karen blinked. "Find who?" "A kid. Little Lemonade, stand off Route 74, maybe 40 minutes out of town. Name's Will, about 12 years old. Brown hair, talks like a lawyer and a comedian at the same time." Karen hesitated. "You want me to locate a lemonade stand kid?" "Yes, today. By noon, his security team had tracked down the area." It took another 2 hours before a driver finally spotted the small wooden stand again, empty this time. Just a table, a folded chair, and that hand-painted sign, "Ice Cold Lemonade." Richard drove out there himself. He waited, engine idling, until a pickup truck pulled up beside the stand. Out stepped Maria and Will, carrying a new pitcher and paper cups. Will's eyes widened. "Hey, you're the lemonade guy," Richard smiled faintly. "Guess that's me." Maria looked uncertain. "Sir, is there a problem?" "No problem," Richard said. "Actually, I came to offer something." He crouched slightly, meeting Will's eyes. "You said you wanted to make videos, right?" Will nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." Richard gestured toward his car. "I run a company that spends millions trying to sell stuff to people. We film commercials, ads, campaigns, but we're missing something real. You, kid, you've got that spark. The way you talk, the way you look people in the eye, it sells." Will frowned, not fully understanding. "You want me to sell lemonade for you?" Richard laughed. "Not exactly. I want you to be in one of my commercials. We'll pay you well. You'll get to see how it all works." Maria's eyes narrowed. "A commercial? For what?" "Cole Enterprises," Richard said. "We're launching a new community campaign. We want to look more human." Maria stepped closer, protective. "And why my boy?" Richard hesitated. "Because he made me stop my car. Nobody else ever does that." For a moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the grass. Maria studied the man in front of her. Expensive suit, dark glasses, a face that looked tired despite all the polish. "Cole," she said gently, "you don't look like a man who stops for anything. What made you stop that day? Richard's jaw tightened. He didn't have an answer that made sense. Maybe I just wanted lemonade, he said, forcing a half smile. Maria didn't buy it, but she nodded anyway. Will looked up at his mother. Mom, can I do it? Please? Maria exhaled. I don't know, honey. I don't trust all that fancy world stuff. Richard softened his tone. Look, ma'am, I'll make sure he's safe. It's just a small shoot, local TV, and I'll personally see to it he's treated like family. Maria crossed her arms. Family? That's a strong word, Mr. Cole. I know, he said quietly. Maybe that's why I used it. There was a long pause. Finally, she said, if you want my permission, there's one condition. Richard raised a brow. Name it. You'll have dinner with us, in our home. Before anything happens. He almost laughed. Dinner? You mean at your house? Yes, Maria said calmly. If you're going to be part of Will's world, even for a moment, you'll step into it properly. Richard looked down at his shoes, then at her steady gaze. Something inside him, pride, maybe, or fear, wanted to refuse. But something else, something quieter, said he should go. He nodded. All right. Dinner it is. That night, as the sun dipped below the fields again, Maria set a small wooden table with 3 plates, a pot of beans, and fresh cornbread. Their house was simple, walls faded by time, but it radiated warmth. The smell of real food, the sound of laughter, the faint hum of an old radio, things Richard hadn't felt in years. He sat stiffly at first, unsure where to put his hands, how to act without the armor of wealth. But Will kept talking, telling stories about his school, his dreams, the time he tried to make lemonade with salt instead of sugar. Richard found himself laughing more than he had in months. At one point, Maria asked quietly, Mar, Cole, do you ever eat with your family? The question hit like a pin in silence. He cleared his throat. My wife travels a lot, and you? I work a lot. Maria smiled sadly. Work's a good thing, as long as it doesn't replace life. For the rest of the evening, he barely spoke. He just listened to the rhythm of their small home, to the sound of genuine care in every word. When it was time to leave, Will handed him a napkin folded neatly. Thanks for coming, sir. Inside, Richard found a drawing, a little BMW parked next to a lemonade stand, both under a bright yellow sun. He stared at it for a long time before saying softly, Thank you, Will. As he drove away, the road stretched before him, the same road he'd always taken, but it didn't feel the same anymore. Somewhere behind him, a boy with a big heart and a mother with faith had opened a door he didn't even know existed. And without realizing it, Richard Cole was already walking toward the man he was meant to become. The studio smelled like coffee, cables, and artificial light. For Will, it felt like another planet. Cameras bigger than he was, people with headsets rushing around, lights brighter than the Texas sun. It was everything he had never seen before. Richard stood off to the side in his gray suit, watching with arms crossed, pretending to look uninterested. But truthfully, he couldn't take his eyes off the kid. The ad was for a simple product, bottled lemonade, of course. But the creative team couldn't figure out how to make it feel genuine. Their scripts were fake smiles and slogans. Then came Will. He didn't even follow the lines. When the director yelled, "Action!" Will just looked straight into the camera and said, "You know what's funny? Some people buy lemonade to feel cool. But when my mom makes it, it's not about being cool. It's about being kind. Because kindness is sweeter." The entire set went silent. Even the cameraman forgot to move for a second. Richard tilted his head. What did he just say? He whispered. The director, a nervous guy named Dave, muttered, He improvised. But it worked. When they replayed the footage, everyone in the room stopped talking. There was something about Will's tone, raw, innocent, real. The kind of truth you can't manufacture with money. Within days, the commercial aired on local TV. It wasn't even meant to go national. But something happened. People shared it. Then more people shared it. Then it exploded. A week later, Richard was in his office, sipping coffee when Karen rushed in. "Sir, you need to see this." She turned the monitor toward him. There it was, Will's face all over social media. Comments flooding in. "This kid is amazing." Finally, an ad with heart. "That boy made me cry over lemonade." Richard leaned forward, stunned. "You're kidding." "Sir," Karen said, barely holding her grin, "we're up 30% in engagement. Reporters are calling. They want to interview the kid." He chuckled under his breath. "The kid." "Will." That afternoon, Richard called Maria. She answered cautiously. "Mr. Cole?" He smiled. "We did it, Maria. Will's commercial went viral." "He's famous." She didn't sound surprised. "I told you. The Lord gives light where people least expect it." He paused, unsure how to respond to that. He'd never thought of it as divine, just lucky. But the way she said it made him think otherwise. In the days that followed, the small lemonade stand on Route 74 became a landmark. People drove out just to take pictures. Will's school called, asking permission to film an interview. Even a national network sent a producer to Dallas, hoping to feature him on a morning show. Through it all, Richard was there, at first as a businessman managing his new golden marketing asset. But slowly, something else began to happen. He started noticing the things around him that didn't make sense anymore. The way his office felt colder than it used to. How no one in his building smiled without checking who was watching. How his own success suddenly felt hollow next to a 12-year-old boy who could change hearts just by being himself. One evening, after another long day of calls and meetings, he stopped by Maria's house again. It had become a habit. He told himself it was just to check on Will's progress, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. Maria was cooking. Will was at the small kitchen table, finishing his homework, humming a song softly under his breath. The smell of stew filled the house, and the sound of laughter made the air feel alive. Richard stood at the doorway for a second before Maria noticed him. "Well, look who's back," she said, smiling. He raised a hand awkwardly. "I was in the area," Maria chuckled. "You were in the area again." "Sit down, Mr. Cole. There's food." He did. And for the second time in his adult life, he felt what home actually meant. As they ate, Will said between bites, "Mr. Cole, did you see the video? People online say I made them cry." "That's weird, right?" Richard smiled faintly. "Not weird, kid. You just reminded them what real looks like." Will grinned. "You think I could make more videos? Like tell stories that help people?" Richard hesitated. "Help people? You mean not sell them something?" "Yeah," Will said simply. "Sell them hope, maybe." Maria looked at Richard quietly, reading his silence. "Hope's a good business, Mr. Cole. Not many invest in it these days." That night, as Richard drove home, her words stayed with him like a hum in the background. "Hope's a good business." He pulled into his mansion's driveway, the automatic lights flicking on one by one. But as he walked inside, the silence felt heavier than usual. He passed by his wedding photo in the hallway, he and his wife smiling under perfect lighting, and for the first time, he noticed how distant that smile was. He poured himself a drink and stared at the reflection in the glass again. That boy had something money couldn't buy. He whispered to himself, maybe he's the story. The next morning, he called Karen. "We're expanding the campaign," he said. "Not about products this time, about people, real people. I want Will front and center." Karen frowned. "Sir, that's not our brand identity." "Then it's time we change it." Within weeks, Will was appearing on national TV, not selling anything, just telling stories. Stories about kindness, resilience, family. The audience loved him. Sponsors lined up. And somewhere between contracts and commercials, Richard started feeling something strange, pride. Not the kind that came from profit, but the kind that comes from seeing someone else shine. He didn't realize it yet, but Will was doing more than changing his company's image. He was changing the man himself. Because for the first time in years, Richard Cole wanted to be someone worth believing in. The penthouse was silent, the kind of silence that hums against the walls like it's alive. Richard stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city glow below him. Dallas looked beautiful at night, glittering towers, moving headlights, the pulse of life, but none of it felt real anymore. It was just lights pretending to be stars. He used to love this view. It reminded him of everything he'd conquered. Now it just reminded him of everything he'd lost. On the marble counter behind him sat a framed photo. Him and his wife, Michelle, taken years ago on their honeymoon in California. He hadn't noticed it in months. He picked it up, brushed off a thin layer of dust, and stared. Her smile looked forced, even back then. How hadn't he seen that? His phone buzzed. Michelle's name lit up on the screen. He hesitated before answering. "Hey," she said flatly. "I'm just letting you know I'll be in New York for a while. The lawyers are drawing things up." He closed his eyes. "So that's it then. It's been it for a long time, Richard," she said quietly. "You just didn't notice." The line went dead. He set the phone down and exhaled. No anger, no shouting, just emptiness. It was strange how a marriage could die quietly, like the sound of a candle going out. Later that night, he poured himself another drink, then another. But the alcohol only made the silence louder. His reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, tired eyes, a face lined by ambition and regret. He whispered to himself, "You built everything, and somehow lost it all." The next morning, he was supposed to be on set for another commercial, but instead, he drove. He didn't even know where. The roads blurred into endless asphalt until he realized where he'd ended up. Route 74. The little lemonade stand was there again, only this time it was empty. A few paper cups on the table, the sign half faded by the sun. Then he saw Maria's truck parked by a nearby oak tree. She was unloading groceries. When she saw his car, she smiled faintly. "Morning, Mr. Cole. You look like you haven't slept." He gave a dry laugh. "I haven't. You make coffee around here?" She nodded toward her porch. "Always." They sat outside, the breeze carrying the smell of lemon trees nearby. The coffee was strong, homemade, not the sleek kind from his espresso machine, but it felt like it woke up something more than just his body. After a few quiet minutes, Maria asked softly, "You lost something, didn't you?" He looked at her, confused. "Excuse me." "That look in your eyes," she said. "I've seen it before. People who've got everything except peace." He almost laughed, but it came out as a sigh. "Peace is expensive." "I'm not sure I can afford it." She smiled gently. "Funny thing about peace, it's the only thing that's free." Will came running out of the house, waving his phone. "Mar, Cole." "The morning show called again. They want me on next week." Richard smiled genuinely. "You're a star, kid," Will grinned. "Nah, I just tell the truth. People like that, I guess." "Yeah," Richard murmured, staring at him. "They really do." After Will ran back inside, Maria turned to Richard again. "He looks up to you, you know. Be careful what kind of man you let him see." The words cut deep. He wanted to say something clever, but nothing came out. That evening, Maria invited him to stay for dinner again. "We're making chili," she said with a grin. "You can help stir." "I don't cook," he replied. "Then you'll learn." The kitchen was small, the counters scratched, the pans old, but there was laughter. Real laughter. Will talked about school. Maria hummed an old hymn under her breath. And Richard, for reasons he couldn't explain, felt safe. It was a kind of warmth he hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. After dinner, Maria pulled out an old Bible. We read a little every night. "You're welcome to join, if you'd like." He froze. "I don't really do church. Neither do a lot of folks." she said calmly. "But we all need something to believe in." He hesitated, then nodded. "All right, just a little." She opened to a passage and read slowly. "What does it profit a man to gain the whole world, yet lose his soul?" Richard sat still, the words sinking in like stones dropped into water. For a moment, he felt exposed, like the verse was written just for him. Maria closed the book. "You know, Mr. Cole, sometimes God doesn't break us to punish us. He breaks us to open us." He didn't say a word. But later that night, as he drove back through the dark, he kept hearing that line, "breaks us to open us." The next few weeks passed quietly. Will's fame grew. The commercial was now national. Sponsors wanted interviews, brands offered partnerships. But amid all the success, Richard's heart kept returning to that tiny house on Route 74. He'd stop by every few days, sometimes with business updates, sometimes with dinner, sometimes with nothing at all. He started noticing little things. The way Maria prayed before meals. The way Will never complained even when money was tight. The way Joy lived in that home, even when nothing about their life was easy. And without meaning to, Richard began to change. He spoke softer. He listened more. He went to church one Sunday, just to see what it felt like. He sat in the back row, anonymous, as a choir sang about grace. He didn't understand half the words, but something inside him stirred. When he got home, he didn't reach for the whiskey. He didn't turn on the TV. He just stood in the quiet, realizing that for the first time in years, silence didn't hurt. He thought of Will, of Maria, of that verse. And for the first time, Richard Cole whispered a prayer. It wasn't eloquent, and it wasn't long. Just a few simple words. "God, if you're real, don't give up on me yet." Outside, the city glowed like it always did. But inside that penthouse, something new was beginning to flicker, small, fragile, but real. The light of a man slowly waking up. The next months rolled by like a slow sunrise. Every week brought something new. Interviews, features, magazine covers. The Lemonade Boy had become a national name. Will's face was everywhere. Morning shows, talk shows, social media. The kid from a dusty roadside stand was now inspiring millions. And yet, through all the noise, Will never changed. He still helped Maria wash dishes every night, still prayed before meals, still waved to the mailman every morning. Fame couldn't touch his heart. Richard watched it all unfold with a strange mix of pride and humility. He was still the businessman behind the curtain, managing deals, protecting contracts, making sure the money flowed. But the more success came in, the more uneasy he felt about what the world called winning. He'd sit in meetings surrounded by suits and charts, hearing words like engagement metrics and growth forecasts. But all he could think about was Maria's small kitchen table, the sound of laughter, the smell of cornbread, the peace. He missed that peace. One Monday morning, his boardroom was full 20 executives, expensive suits, a table so polished it reflected the fluorescent lights. His partner, Greg Tanner, was presenting numbers on a giant screen. "Gentlemen, the Cole Enterprises brand has never looked better. Profits up 24%. National visibility off the charts. And all thanks to this campaign." He gestured to the screen where Will's smiling face appeared holding a glass of lemonade. Everyone clapped, but Richard didn't. He stared at the image for a long moment, then stood slowly. "Greg," he said, voice calm but firm, "how much of that profit came from the chemical division?" Greg blinked. Roughly half." "Why? That's the one that's been under investigation, right?" "Environmental violations?" Greg shifted uneasily. "It's just paperwork. Every big company doesn't dump waste into rivers near low-income neighborhoods," Richard said sharply. The room went silent. He looked around, eyes steady. "I've spent years pretending we could sell kindness while poisoning the ground people live on. Not anymore." Greg scoffed. "What are you saying, Richard?" "I'm saying," he replied slowly, I'm shutting down the division, effective immediately. The board erupted. Shouts, protests, disbelief. Greg slammed his hand on the table. You can't just walk away from that kind of revenue. We'll lose millions. Then we'll lose millions, Richard said. Maybe we'll keep something better in return. He left the meeting without another word. Outside, the city wind hit his face like a wave. He hadn't felt this alive in years. That evening, he drove straight to Maria's house. Will opened the door, eyes wide. Mr. Cole, you look happy? Richard laughed softly. I think I am. Maria appeared behind him, drying her hands. That's a new look for you. I made a decision today, he said. One that's going to cost me a lot of money. Maria tilted her head. But maybe it'll buy you peace. He nodded. Exactly that. They sat outside under the porch light. Will was talking about his next big interview, a national TV spot in New York, when Richard interrupted gently. You know, Will, the world's about to put you under a lot of lights. Bright ones. Don't let them blind you, Will smiled. I won't. I got my mom, I got God, and I got you watching my back, right? Richard felt something in his chest twist. Yeah, kid. You got me. A week later, they flew to New York. It was Will's first time on a plane. He pressed his face to the window the entire flight, awestruck by the clouds. This is crazy, he whispered. It's like we're flying through heaven. Richard smiled faintly. Maybe we are. The interview was perfect. Will's charm disarmed the host. The audience adored him, and the internet went wild again. The clip was shared millions of times within hours. When they got back to Dallas, reporters waited outside the airport. Richard could have spoken, but he let Will take the microphone. What do you want to be when you grow up? One reporter asked. Will grinned. I don't know. Maybe someone who helps people feel less alone. That line made national headlines. But for Richard, the biggest change wasn't happening on the screens. It was inside his own home. He stopped drinking. He started attending church with Maria and Will every Sunday. He began showing up at small gatherings, barbecues, fundraisers, youth programs. Not as the billionaire, but as a man trying to be useful. At first, people didn't believe it. Some called it PR. Others thought he'd gone soft. But those who met him in person saw it. He wasn't faking it. Something in his eyes had changed. One night, after church, Richard stayed behind as the choir packed up. The pastor, a kind gray-haired man named Reverend Harris, approached him. "M.R. Cole," he said warmly, "you've been coming for weeks now. What brings you here?" Richard hesitated. "Guilt, I think. Maybe grace. I'm still figuring out which." The pastor smiled. "That's all right. God can work with both." He nodded slowly. "I've spent my life chasing everything I thought mattered. Money, respect, power. But that kid, that boy, he reminded me what I lost." Reverend Harris patted his shoulder. "Sometimes the smallest voices call us back the loudest." When he got home that night, Richard stood on his balcony and looked out over the city again. The same skyline, the same lights, but for once, he didn't feel empty. He whispered to himself, "I think I'm finally learning what the story's about." And in a small house on the outskirts of town, Maria was praying. She didn't pray for riches or fame. She prayed for that man, that once cold soul now finding warmth again. Because somewhere between a dusty lemonade stand and the bright lights of New York, God had begun rewriting both their stories. The next few years passed like a miracle unfolding in slow motion. Will's fame didn't fade, it evolved. What began as a viral moment turned into a movement. His authenticity became his brand. His words about kindness and hope reached people who were tired of noise and lies. He wasn't just the lemonade boy anymore. He was Will Carter, the voice of something pure in a world that had forgotten how to listen. And right beside him, no longer hidden behind corporate walls, stood Richard Cole. Not the slick CEO everyone used to fear, but a man reborn through humility. Together, they founded Brightside Media, a company built on one idea: stories that lift people up instead of selling them out. Their first show wasn't flashy. It was just Will interviewing ordinary folks with extraordinary hearts. A single mother who started a food bank, a veteran helping other veterans heal, a janitor who put 10 kids through college. Every episode ended with Will saying the same thing: "You don't need to be famous to make a difference. You just need to care." The show exploded. Millions tuned in each week. Brands begged to sponsor them, but Richard refused the ones that didn't share their values. "If it doesn't do good," he'd say, "we don't touch it." Will would laugh. "You've changed, Mr. Cole," Richard would smile. "I think your mom had something to do with that." And she did. Maria was their constant. She still lived in her modest house, still cooked too much food for anyone who showed up, still prayed before every meal. But now her prayers were full of gratitude for Will's purpose, for Richard's redemption, for the strange and holy friendship that had grown between them. Richard visited often, sometimes bringing business plans, sometimes bringing nothing at all. He'd sit on her porch, sipping sweet tea while Will filmed inside, and Maria would talk about life. "Money's not evil," she'd say, "but it's a bad master. Use it like a seed, not a shield." Richard nodded every time. He was learning. One summer evening, a letter arrived, an invitation for Will to host a national youth summit in Washington. He'd be speaking to thousands of students about leadership and faith. Will was nervous. "What if I mess it up?" he said. Maria cupped his face. "You won't. You'll just tell the truth, like always." Richard added softly, "You've got this, kid. Just remember who you are, the boy who sold lemonade with heart." At the summit, Will walked onto a stage lined with lights so bright they blurred the audience into a sea of faces. He took a deep breath and began. "I used to think success was about how many people saw you," he said. "But now I know it's about how many people you see. The ones who need a smile, a hand, or just a little hope. I learned that from two people, a mom with faith, and a man who stopped his car one hot Texas day." The crowd rose to their feet. Cameras flashed, people cried, and somewhere backstage, Richard wiped his eyes quietly. That night, they flew home together. The plane hummed softly in the dark, clouds glowing beneath them. Will turned to Richard and said, "You know, Mr. Cole, sometimes I think God made you stop that car just for me." Richard smiled faintly. "Maybe he made me stop it for me." They laughed. But under the laughter, they both knew it was true. Back in Texas, things only grew from there. Brightside expanded into podcasts, films, mentorship programs for underprivileged kids, all built on the same foundation of empathy. Richard put millions into scholarships and small business grants. Will mentored teenagers who dreamed of being storytellers, but success never came without tests. Maria's health began to fade. The years had been kind to her spirit, but not to her body. Doctors spoke gently, using words like fatigue and treatment options. Will tried to stay strong, but every time he saw her hands tremble, his heart cracked a little. One evening, she called both of them to her bedside. The room smelled of lavender and sunlight. She was weak, but her smile was still strong. "You two," she whispered, "you're my boys. Promise me you'll keep doing what you're doing, not for fame, not for money, but for souls. This world's hurting. It needs men who remember love." Richard took her hand. "We promise." Will leaned close, tears in his eyes. "We love you, Mom." She closed her eyes. "I know, and I love you both, more than all the lemonade in Texas." They laughed through their tears. It was a small moment, but it would stay etched in their hearts forever. In the months that followed, while Maria rested, Richard and Will worked harder than ever. Every project, every donation, every act of kindness became a way to honor her. Richard began speaking at churches, not about business, but about grace, about how a broken man can still find light. Will continued to share stories, his voice steady even when his heart ached. And through it all, that simple truth remained. Everything good in their lives had begun on a roadside with a wooden stand and a $1 cup of lemonade. The summer sun was softer that year. It came through Maria's curtains like liquid gold, resting over her hands as she lay in bed. The hum of life outside, the cicadas, the wind brushing the trees, felt distant, muted, like the world itself was holding its breath. Will sat beside her, holding her hand. Richard sat in the corner, silent. He had faced boardrooms, cameras, headlines, lawsuits, but nothing had ever felt as heavy as this small, quiet room. Maria's health had been declining for months. The doctors had done what they could, but she seemed at peace with what was coming. "Don't be sad," she told them one morning, smiling weakly. "I've been ready for a while. I just needed to make sure you two weren't lost anymore." Will tried to smile, but tears blurred his eyes. "You think we're ready?" She looked at him lovingly. "Baby, you've been ready since the day you poured that first cup of lemonade." Then her eyes moved to Richard. "And you, Mr. Cole, I think you've been ready since the day you tasted it." He laughed softly through the lump in his throat. "It was too sweet. It was perfect," she whispered. "It just needed faith to balance the sugar." The days that followed were slow. Will barely left her side. Richard came every morning and stayed until night. Sometimes they just sat in silence, listening to the ticking clock. Sometimes she told them stories about her childhood, about losing Will's father, about the nights she'd pray with nothing but faith to keep her warm. One evening, as the sky turned the color of peaches, Maria asked Richard to walk with her to the porch. He tried to protest, she was too weak, but she insisted. So he helped her out, step by step, until they reached her favorite old chair. The air was soft and still. She looked out over the fields where the stand once stood. "Funny, isn't it?" she said. "How one stop can change everything." He nodded quietly. "You changed everything, Maria. You and that boy." She turned her head toward him, her eyes clear despite the years. "No, Richard. God did. We just said yes." She coughed, then smiled faintly. "You remember the first time you came here for dinner? You sat right there, stiff as a statue." He chuckled. "I didn't know how to act. You didn't need to. You just needed to feel." "I didn't know how to do that either," he said quietly. She reached out and touched his hand. "You do now. Don't lose it." They sat there for a while, watching the last bit of sun dip below the horizon. It felt like the world was saying goodbye with her. That night, she slipped away in her sleep, peacefully. No fear, no struggle, just a breath that never came back. Will cried like his heart had been torn in half. Richard sat beside the bed, his head in his hands, silent. He didn't pray. He just whispered, "Thank you." The funeral was small but full of love. Neighbors, church members, a few of Will's fans who'd come just to pay respects. Richard covered all the expenses quietly, refusing any credit. When the service ended, he stayed behind after everyone left. He stood by her grave, the wind moving gently through the tall grass. "I don't know how to say goodbye," he said softly. "So I won't. I'll just keep going, the way you wanted." And he did. In the months that followed, Richard poured his heart into the Maria Foundation, dedicated to single mothers and children living in poverty. He sold 2 of his companies to fund it, shocking the business world. When reporters asked why, he simply said, "Because you can't take any of it with you, but you can leave light behind." He donated 30% of his entire fortune to Maria's church, enough to rebuild it, expand its outreach, and fund dozens of community programs. On Sunday mornings, he sat in the front pew with Will, no cameras, no bodyguards, just 2 men honoring the woman who'd saved them both. Will continued his work with Brightside Media, now using part of their profits to support the foundation. He often told their story on stage, his voice steady but thick with feeling. "I grew up thinking the world was small," he'd say. But then one man stopped his car, and a woman with faith opened her door. And that's how I learned that love, real love, multiplies. Sometimes, after events, Richard would walk up to him, pat his shoulder and say, "Your mom would be proud." Will would smile. "She already is." Years passed. The world moved fast as it always does, but some things never changed. Every year, on the anniversary of Maria's passing, Richard and Will rebuilt that old lemonade stand, not as a business, but as a charity table. They gave out free lemonade and collected donations for families in need. People came from all over, young, old, rich, poor, to meet the men whose story had touched the nation. Richard always stood quietly behind the stand, watching Will pour lemonade for children, telling jokes, handing out hugs. And every time someone asked why they did it, Richard would answer, "Because once, a boy sold me lemonade, and it saved my life." Years later, the world looked different. The skyline of Dallas was brighter, the roads wider, the city busier. But every year, on the same summer day, something familiar appeared on Route 74, a small wooden stand with a hand-painted sign that read, "Ice-cold lemonade, free today." Private jets, offices, investments, all of that stayed somewhere far behind. Will and Richard would drive the old pickup instead, the one that used to carry Maria's groceries, the back filled with pitchers of lemonade and boxes of paper cups. They never announced it, never called the press. People just knew. Families came, church kids came, truckers stopped on their routes. Some had been there the very first time. Some had only seen the story online. Will, now in his 30s, still had that same open smile, though there were tiny lines near his eyes, marks of laughter, of a full life. Richard's hair had gone gray, but his eyes were steady and kind, the way Maria once said they could be if he ever found peace. He poured a cup for a little girl waiting at the front of the line and said, "This one's on the house." She giggled. "They're all on the house, mister." He laughed. "You're right. They always were." When the crowd thinned, Will leaned against the counter and looked out over the dusty road. "You ever think about how far we've come?" Richard nodded slowly. "Every day. You ever miss it? The old world, the deals, the rush?" Richard took a sip of lemonade, squinting toward the sun. "No, I traded noise for purpose. Best deal I ever made." A silence settled between them, the kind of silence that feels like music. Then Will said softly, "You know, I still hear her sometimes. Mom, every time we do this." Richard smiled. "Me too. Usually when I'm about to complain." They both laughed until tears stung their eyes. Across the road, a group of kids were helping an elderly couple set up chairs. One of them waved, and Will waved back. That's what she wanted, right? People helping people. Richard nodded. That's what she lived for. As evening fell, the sky turned a deep Texas orange. The last car drove off, leaving them alone with the stand and the crickets. Richard looked at the empty cups stacked neatly, at the dust glowing in the sunset. "You know," he said, "this is where my story really began." Will smiled. "Mine too. Guess we both found what we were thirsty for." Richard turned to him, his voice low but strong. "Will, when I stopped here that first day, I thought I was the one buying something. But the truth is, you and your mom, you bought me back." Will swallowed hard. "She'd say you just needed a little faith." Richard nodded. "And a good lemonade." They laughed again, but this time it was soft, peaceful, the kind of laughter that doesn't need an audience. As the last light faded, Richard pulled out a small wooden box from the truck bed. Inside was a plaque, engraved in simple letters, "To Maria Carter, who taught two men that the sweetest thing in life isn't lemonade, but love." They nailed it to the side of the stand together. Will stepped back and looked at it, eyes shining. "Think she can see it?" Richard looked up at the darkening sky. "I think she never stopped." The night grew quiet. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass. The old stand stood proud, lit only by the soft glow of the stars, the same place where a lost man once stopped his car. and a little boy with a big heart handed him a cup that tasted like redemption. And somewhere, in that hush between earth and heaven, it felt as if Maria herself was smiling, because what began as a simple act of kindness had become a legacy. A reminder to anyone passing by that even the smallest moment, one stop, one word of love, can change everything.